Chapter 24. The footsteps came closer, echoing in his head, as if his head was empty of anything but footsteps. He should do something. Get up. Run. But his arms wouldn't move, nor would his feet. If he could only stand, that would be a start. So blindly he stood, and then he keeled over onto his knees. Strong hands grabbed him by the arms, lifted him, placed him back on a seat, where he fell backwards until he was leaning against stone, cold and wet. He opened his eyes. Everywhere was stone, even the face before him. Then it became flesh, a man, his features indistinguishable, the only light coming from behind him, a bright halo of light that pricked at Jim's eyes painfully. The man stepped back a bit, and Jim could see now that he had no halo. It was Father Fisher. The next minute, he was kneeling before him. He had a thermos in one hand and a cup in the other. There was water in the cup. Jim saw the light glimmer on the clear surface of the water. Fisher brought the cup to Jim's lips, and he drank. For a moment, cool water was all there was in the world. Jim leaned back again, breathing hard. He rested, leaned forward, and the cup was there again. He wanted to hold it, but for some reason he couldn't. Then it dawned on him that his hands were bound behind him. He felt the rope tight against his wrists, his ankles too. He started to panic, but didn't have the energy for it. He relaxed, opened his eyes, careful not to look into the light. Fisher's face, what he could see of it, looked worried. His raven hair was mussed, the bruise on his cheek was livid. But then Jim's attention was diverted, for behind Fisher's left shoulder there was another man. He was sitting in what looked like a car seat, except the car seat wasn't in a car. Where were they? A cave. Jim looked up. The walls rose around him, pale as flesh, but veined with shining green stones, the same green as Father's crucifix, but he wasn't wearing it now. And the other man? He was near the light, and his hair gleamed white, white as corn silk. It was long, tied back in a ponytail. He was looking at Jim, the light glinting off pale blue eyes. "Tuffy?" said Jim. The man looked pained, and that's when Jim noticed that he was tied up as well. Fisher's hand came towards Jim's face. Jim flinched, but the huge hand only touched his forehead. It felt cool, and Jim closed his eyes and leaned against it. With eyes shut, it could almost have been his own father's hands. "You're all right," said Fisher soothingly. "You had a bad fall." Jim opened his eyes and squinted at the light that lit the cave. It was a hurricane lamp, kerosene, hanging from a bracket on the wall, a spike jammed into a cleft in the rock. It lit up the top of a large wooden spool, the kind they rolled telephone cable onto, but now it was on its side like a low table. There was other makeshift furniture, a crate, a shelf made of boards and piled stones, a car seat where the man who was not Tuffy sat. Jim stared at his fellow captive. He had a ratty sleeping bag draped around his shoulders. His face was cut and bruised, and it came to Jim who it must be. Stanley. But now Fisher turned Jim's face towards him. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said. "It would have all worked out just fine." The sincerity in his voice seemed so real. He was apologizing. "You shouldn't have come here, Jim," he said. And unlike the threats of the night before, there was real sadness in his voice. Jim dared to speak. "What are you going to do?" Fisher lowered his head. "I don't know," he said. "I just don't know anymore." Then there was silence. Jim heard water dripping a long way off. It was impossible to tell how big the cavern was, for the lantern only lit up one small corner. Jim looked at the makeshift shelf beside him. There was an old peanut tin filled with odds and ends, a yo-yo, a chrome lighter. Beside the tin, a pile of soggy dime comics, a coiled length of string, a cigar box, a black phone with a dial. It was a clubhouse. His father, Eldon Fisher, and Tuffy had come here, made this place their own, and looking at Fisher now, still kneeling on the cold floor, his head still bent, Jim knew that it was to this underground room that Fisher had fled the night of the fire that killed Francis Tufts. It was here that God spoke to him, just like in the Sunday school picture. Except that Fisher had got it wrong. This far underground, it wasn't likely God who had spoken to him. The parson sighed, took a deep breath, and climbed slowly to his feet. He leaned forward, his hands on his knees, the better to look Jim in the eye. I have to go up top again, he said. There's a call I'm waiting for. Jim's eyes skittered to the back telephone, but it wasn't connected to anywhere. He watched Fisher check on Stanley, check the ropes that bound him to his car seat. You okay? Fisher asked. Oh, I'm just hunky-dory, said Stanley. Thank you so much for asking. His accent was southern, his tone dry. With one last aggrieved backward glance, Fisher's headed off into the gloom beyond Lantern's light. Jim heard his footsteps retreat, following the smaller beam of a pocket flashlight that finally disappeared around some bend in the deeper darkness of the cavern. You are Stanley, said Jim. The man managed a painful smile. At your service, he said. Well, truth to tell, not at your service. Where's he going? Up top, said Stanley. The 4x4 has a cell phone in it. He borrowed it from some parishioner. Wonder if she has any idea what he wanted it for. Stanley shook his head sadly. He's waiting for a call from the warden of the church to say a certain package has arrived. In it are some letters from my mother. When he's got them in his hot little hands, then I get released. That's the plan, anyway. He glanced with some exasperation at Jim, but his voice was ironic. Who are you, anyhow? What you want to do getting yourself in this mess? I'm Jim Hawkins, Hub's son. The good-natured frown on Stanley's face tightened. I'm sorry for what my father did, said Jim, squaring his chin, but he couldn't have known he was doing it. My father would never have hurt someone on purpose. His voice was shaking, but there was a kind of cracked pride in it. Stanley nodded slowly. I know it, he said. Fisher tricked him. You know what happened? Stanley sighed. Well, according to our talkative captor, Francis came around to Wolf Fisher's house on that New Year's Eve back in '72, wanting money, wanting revenge even. I don't doubt it. He'd been at reform school. I suppose he figured it was time he collected. Fisher, Sr., was out. Our holy friend here took my brother in, fed him Christmas leftovers, gave him his father's finest rye. Francis was always partial to drink. Fisher promised him his reward, and when he was good and sleepy, he found him sleeping gear and led him down to our old homestead in the low field. He made sure he was warm and cozy. He paused to make sure Jim was following. Then I guess he went and roused Hub. There was a New Year's gathering at your place as well. Hub snuck out with anyone knowing it, and that's when Fisher tricked him. He complained about his old man, how Wilf, with all his money, kept him on a short chain, what a crab he was, etc., etc. He kind of threw Hub a bone, you see, and Hub, he gnawed on it. He hated Will Fisher, and Fisher encouraged him to a white-hot hatred. Stanley stared off into space for a moment. Jim didn't need to hear the rest. So he convinced my dad it would be a cool prank to burn down the old house. Stanley nodded. He turned to Jim. He lit his fuse, you might say. He paused again in silent reverie. Dry hay goes up real good, he added. It must have been quite a blaze. Jim felt a calmness come over him. This was the whole of the sad truth. His own father was neither guiltless nor entirely guilty. He was the victim of a terrible trick, but also the victim of his own anger. There was no denying it. Stanley suddenly interrupted his thoughts. You know what the devil Fisher believes, Jim Hawkins? He believes God sent that mighty snowstorm to cover their tracks. He truly believes the Lord loves him. Stanley stretched the word love, made it 2 syllables long, a white snowstorm of love. I'm not a religious man myself, but that strikes me as the worst kind of blasphemy. It was perverted. What there was left of faith in Jim was filled with revulsion. Stanley looked at Jim, and his battered face was a snarl of emotions, anger, remorse, bewilderment. My mother and I, we kind of blew it, big time. He appealed to Jim with his eyes. I never wanted to do it at all. Not that I'm pleading innocence here. It was my mother's plan. She had this wicked bee, and it wasn't in her bonnet, no, sir, but in her very soul. She had lost her son. She demanded justice. Can you see that? I think so, said Jim. More hate, he was thinking. Hatred begat hatred. But why so many years after it happened? Stanley looked up. It started with a letter, about 2 years ago, from an old-timer by the name of Jock Boomhauer, a former neighbor of yours, I guess. Jim nodded. He wrote a kind of deathbed confession. He went out of his way to track us down, even hired a detective. Then he wrote to us. Told us he'd seen Fisher and your father at the old house that night of the fire. He didn't say nothing at the inquiry. He was mad as hell at Francis, glad to see him go, so he kept his mouth shut. But I guess he didn't want St. Peter to bring it up when he was standing at the heavenly gates, if you catch my meaning. Jim nodded. Why'd Boomhauer hate Francis? Stanley shook his head, because Francis, God rest his soul, was an idiot. They were all idiots, the three of them, and I don't mind telling you that. But it was my brother, without a doubt the biggest idiot of the lot, who took it upon himself to burn down the old shed on Jock Boomhauer's spread. Except he didn't know Jock had moved a cow and her new calf in there. Jock didn't get them out. Anyway, Francis was arrested the same night. The others, I guess, were plumb terrified. They hadn't been with him that night, but it was enough to make him quit their arsonist ways forever. Almost, Jim said. Huh? Almost quit forever. Silence descended again. Jim didn't want to hear any more. He wanted out of the chain of events that had led him here. Out of everything. He wanted to return to the present. He wanted to return to the place where the future started. He wriggled his wrists tentatively. There was no give. He wriggled his ankles. It was impossible. He's good at knots, huh? Said Stanley. A regular Boy Scout. Jim tried again until his wrists were chafed and burning. Stanley didn't watch. Good luck, he said, dispiritedly. I've been trying for as long as I've been down this God-forsaken hole. Jim looked around the cavern for something sharp, saw nothing. The lantern flickered, caught his attention. They had lanterns just like this at home. When you lived in the farthest corner of the country, power outages were common, and it took hydro crews a long time to replace fallen lines. Jim knew all about hurricane lanterns. I think I've got an idea, he said.